So my mother gave birth to me the summer before her senior year of high school, just 38 days following her 17th birthday in Memphis, Tennessee. And circumstances forced us to have to follow my biological father on a very interesting journey, a journey that would eventually lead to an uprooting of the family and their young 20-somethings, and off we went to Peoria, Illinois, where my dad landed a job as a bun tray handler, making a few dollars above minimum wages at Butternut Bakery there in Peoria. And family was doing great, and then a major turn of events happened at Christmas of 1982. I was 5 years of age. My dad showed up and decided that it was time to abruptly end the relationship. He had had enough of all the drama and all the chaos in their relationship, and so he said, it's over. So mother and I were literally put on a bus, a Greyhound, and we headed back home to Memphis only to find ourselves homeless and hopeful and displaced, hoping that someone would literally show up at the bus station, pick us up, and take us back to their place of residence. The gentleman who would eventually become my stepfather showed up at the bus station, and he took us back to this duplex you see in this image at 686 Richmond Avenue. Now, this image is not only indicative of the world around me growing up, but it's also reflective of the fact that I did not have a strong community of support to help me navigate the relational, emotional, and psychological trauma that I would face as a kid growing up. It's also reflective of the fact that I did not have a community around me to help me navigate what I would like to label as high-impact decision-making throughout my journey. Decisions that would ultimately influence the entire trajectory of my life. One such example of a not-so-great decision was during my junior year of high school, when my football coach called me to his office to share this fantastic news about playing ball at an Ivy League institution, Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Now, I wish I could tell you all differently, but the truth of the matter is that I never even entertained the offer. In fact, not only did I not entertain that offer, I didn't entertain any offer to consider playing ball at an Ivy League institution or a prestigious liberal arts institution. I had the grades, I had the ambition, I had the capacity, but once again, I did not have the community around me to help me think about life outside of the classroom or life beyond high school. And so ultimately, I made a decision, a very familiar decision, and I showed up on campus at a school called Tennessee Tech University in Cookeville, Tennessee. I signed a full football scholarship to play ball there in the fall of 1995. And upon showing up on campus at Tech, I discovered that I had a roommate who was still addicted to the streets. That roommate of mine, the irony of me being here in Douglasville today is that that roommate of mine actually went to McEachern High School in Powder Springs, Georgia, which is not far from here at all. And nonetheless, because of his background and his history, that roommate of mine was literally selling drugs out of our room, and he eventually got locked up and did 16 years of federal time in connection to federal drug trafficking charges. So my roommate issue, among many other issues in my life at that time, led me to forsake my scholarship after only one semester and relocate back home to finish out my journey at the University of Memphis. Now, kids who normally come from backgrounds like mine don't usually finish the process statistically. But I was blessed to be able to rebound. I actually graduated Student of the Year, my major, had some incredible internships. I was Intern of the Year for one of the nation's largest internship programs. I worked for companies that were leaders in their industries in college. I also worked for Kraft Foods, R.J. Reynolds, and even 3M following college. And so I was having the ride of my life. I had a very promising and lucrative career ahead of me. And my purpose in telling you all of that is not at all to brag on myself, but it's to suggest that ultimately the average kid that comes from a background like mine does not usually have the same privilege of escaping the streets of poverty as I do. You see, my story is indeed a total anomaly. In fact, to put that in perspective, I'd like to share a few more tidbits about kids or stories that come from backgrounds similar to mine, where environment has everything to do with the implications of the ultimate outcome of our lives. Back to my story. What I left out is that my mother was actually abandoned at the age of 7 by her biological mother. Her dad wasn't in the picture. He was a truck driver. So she was 7. She had a 5-year-old sister and a 3-year-old brother. And they were relegated to have to move in with her paternal grandparents. And as the journey would have it, she moved in eventually back in with her biological father, who had remarried, and his wife had 8 kids. So she moved back into that house, and then she got pregnant with me. So all of a sudden, newsflash, we don't have more room for you and an infant. So my mom was actually displaced from the home of her biological father. And off she went to move in with my biological father, who was also the product of a single mom with 8 kids by 3 different men. Now, what's even more traumatizing to an extent is that of the 8 kids that my grandmother had on my dad's side of the family, of the 8 kids, 4 of those, my dad being one of them, was actually born to an extramarital affair. So in other words, I know it sounds confusing. My biological grandfather on my dad's side of the family was a married man with a family living across the city. And while he was birthing children with his own wife, he was simultaneously birthing children with my grandmother. Very confusing and chaotic story. So imagine those 2 kids coming together and consummating to bring this guy into the world. Not only was there obviously a lot of trauma and drama in their lives, but there was also a lot of trauma and drama in my life as well. And so many people would like to say that, oh, Anthony, the X factor in your life could be the notion of education, right? So many people would make the proclamation that ultimately it was the education that separated you from a number of other stories in your life, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. But I want to tell you a few more stories. And then I want to dive into this notion around education and what I believe should be alongside education in terms of helping to lift kids out of poverty. I think of an uncle that I have who is in his 60s, and he's locked up in the state of New York right now, doing federal time for also connections to federal drug trafficking charges. Growing up in Memphis, he actually went by the alias Peaches. He was a real-life pimp. He actually ran the streets, drugs, crime, gangs, everything you can imagine. And the residue of his story from many years ago has followed him to the point where he's actually serving federal time in the state of New York right now. I think of another uncle of mine who had the most promising academic possibilities on my dad's side of the family. Out of the 8 kids, everyone would say he was the brightest in the bunch. And yet, he was drafted by the streets, drafted by gangs, drafted by drugs. That uncle is in his 50s right now, living at home with his 80-plus-year-old mother, battling Tourette syndrome, and still overcoming his lifelong battle with crack addiction. I'll tell you one final story, and then I'll get into the theme behind my message. My 4th grade best friend was a guy named Deontay McBee. And I don't mind sharing Deontay's name because it's public record. That Deontay is currently doing life plus 47 years as a result of armed robbery and first-degree murder. Now, looking back, Deontay and I, we were a terror in Miss Alexander's fourth grade classroom at Cherokee Elementary. In fact, Miss Alexander, if you happen to be watching this video, I apologize to you for all the trouble that Deontay and I caused you in your 4th grade classroom. And I think back over my life, and the biggest X factor, or the biggest separation between Deontay and I, was the fact that my 5th grade teacher actually embraced me outside of the context of the classroom. It wasn't just about the academics. For the first time in my life, somebody came alongside me and spoke into my life outside of the traditional, conventional academic system. It mattered a ton in my life to have someone like that. Deontay was not as blessed and not as fortunate to have somebody intervene and speak into his life in arenas outside of the traditional and conventional academic classroom. And so here we go again. Some people would make the argument that the greatest X factor to my success compared to so many other people's success could be, in fact, the education that I was able to attain. And so I would like to make this suggestion. Here's my proclamation. You could state that education is the single greatest ingredient, it's the single greatest attribution factor to determining success versus not. But I'd like to say, you would not be incorrect to make that assumption, but you would be incomplete. You would not be incorrect, but you would be incomplete. See, my stance and my proclamation is that it's not just the conventional academic subject content in the classroom that matters in the lives of kids who come from backgrounds like mine. There are some intangible forces. There are some things that happen outside of the classroom when those kids hit the doors at 3:15 or whatever time they get out. At 3:16, they're running right back into the very streets that are trying to arrest them and suck them in. And if we're not providing a solution outside of the traditional academic classroom, then what's going to happen is that kids are going to turn to what's familiar to them, and the classroom in and of itself will not suffice. So the X factor is bigger than just a pure education. Let me validate my point. Here's an image of 2 classrooms side by side. The one on the left, the early 1900s. The one on the right, the 21st century. We see a lot of differences here, right? The one on the right is in color. there's a lot more diversity, etc. But the commonality between these two images, and while we can't see them, but there's likely an orator standing at the front of the room, pontificating information, pontificating facts and data and details, driving this information into the minds of these kids, in hopes that when it's time for a state proficiency exam or a standardized test, that these kids will be able to regurgitate all the data and all the facts and all the contents that they're driving into their heads. Now, this model worked in the early 1900s. Why? Because then you couldn't pick up your phone or your laptop and in 20 seconds find the answer to a factual question, a data-driven question. You didn't know what was happening around the world in a matter of 10 seconds. So in the early movement of education in the 1900s in our country, this system actually worked. But here we are in the 21st century, using the exact same paradigm we used in the early 1900s to educate kids. Our intention is actually to have them compete in a global economy, yet the very system that we're trying to teach them on in how to compete is not equipped enough to prepare them to actually compete, because we're teaching them to compete as we taught them in the early 1900s. Are you with me? So while there's a lot of commonality here, it's upsetting and it's a crying shame, in my opinion, that we're still using the exact same academic paradigm to try to actually move our students forward. Here's some statistics. 1.3 million kids will actually drop out of high schools in our country this year. More than 50% of those will be students of color. And more than 60% of those will be kids from low-income communities. Here's the evidence of what our actual education system in and of itself is actually doing. Look at this. Compare that to a middle to high income community where kids who are from middle to high income communities will get a bachelor's degree by the age of 25, 54%. On the contrary, if you happen to be a kid who's from a background like mine, there's a 9 out of 100 chance, or a 10% chance, 9% to be precise, that you'll actually get a bachelor's degree by the age of 25. By the age of 25. I don't know about you, but those statistics are appalling to me. So this is evidence that the traditional, conventional academic system alone is not sufficient enough to help lift kids out of poverty. We're wondering why we're seeing all the gang and all the crime activities, et cetera, is because we're not addressing issues that are happening in the streets outside of the classroom. So you cannot expect a kid to come in after having experienced rape or trauma or anything else, abuse. They've experienced that the night before, and we expect them to show up in the classroom the next day, sit down and solve the Pythagorean theorem. Don't open your mouth, sit down, shut up, pay attention to this lecturer standing there for an hour pounding you with information. Imagine that. Imagine why it took me until 5th grade before I figured out that conduct was just as important as academic performance. Because there was so much trauma going on in my life that I did not have a community to help me navigate everything I was going through psychologically. And so I acted out. It was familiar to me. What I saw kids do in the hood, what I saw, older people that I looked up to, gang members, et cetera, do out in the community, that's exactly what I did in the classroom. Inciting the same response that they were reciting in the community. So guess what? We have to engage students outside of the traditional classroom and focus on something I'd like to call the intangibles. And so I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. Years ago, I was in corporate America, as I mentioned, and I knew I would one day want to devote my life to full-time service in the nonprofit space. So to fast forward many years, I became the CEO of a national faith-based organization. And in that organization, during my 6-year tenure, we trained 23,000 inner-city youth pastors all across the United States. And while in many ways that was a fulfilling role for me, there was something missing. And that something is what I'd like to label as the and. See, we did an incredible job of inspiring kids with hope. But what kids from poverty were missing was a how. If you're a kid from poverty, I'd like to make the claim that you need a hope and a how. A practical, pragmatic way to escape the streets of poverty and truncate the generational cycles that have been following you the majority of your life. So in response, a team of us decided to create an organization called the Gifted Education Foundation, where our mission is to produce marketplace leaders from low-income communities across America. And in doing so, it's a 3-year-old organization, and we spent 2 years beta testing right here in the heart of Atlanta, Georgia. And we took samples of students from local high schools, and we followed those students on a journey throughout the entire course of their senior year. And the intention was to put our fingers on the pulse of what some of the issues in life were outside of the classroom. They had been going to school their entire lives, right? And according to their grades, they had everything going on. They had the GPAs, etc. But when we got them in the classroom and you heard the stories of trauma and pain and rape and molestation and gang violence and murders and dads being locked up in prison, there was so much under the hood of these students. And we knew that long term they had no shot at succeeding if we did not intervene and provide the intangible support they needed to actually excel long term. So we created a curriculum called the Intangibles. And that curriculum is comprised of 6 modules. Module 1 deals with life skills, basically mental health and life skills. And we deal with issues around suicide and emotional trauma and psychological trauma, etc. And Module 2 is an etiquette module. And in that, we talk about social media etiquette, email etiquette, text messaging etiquette, the difference between communicating with a peer in the hood versus communicating with someone in a professional setting. We have a relationships module where we teach kids about peer-to-peer relationships, sex and dating and intimate relationships, even supervisory to basically reporter relationships. So teaching kids how to deal with authority. Because if kids from gangs in the streets, they have trouble dealing with conventional authority. So we have to teach kids about those types of behaviors. We have a college readiness module. We have a career readiness module. And finally, we have a module around generosity and service. Because we believe it's important to help kids understand the value of once they get assets in their lives, it's critically important that they in turn reach back into the community and lift kids up who come from backgrounds similar to their own. Here's a model that we actually use, and I won't go into the details of that. I just wanted you to see an image of the model. So essentially, a kid could enter in phase 1 in 9th grade, and we literally follow that student all the way through college graduation or career ascension, and we follow them all the way until they become leaders of the marketplace. We assign mentors side by side with these students who walk with them using our Intangibles curriculum for the entire duration of the process. So they have one-on-one and group mentorship. I like to label it the manufactured father or the manufactured big brother. 80% of the kids who we work with don't have a father in the home, and so we have to manufacture fatherhood as an example for these students. So we surround them with mentors and relationships and subject content relative to the intangibles to actually support them on the journey and help them in the areas of their life where they have not had support, similar to my story in many ways. Finally, our goal is to actually share this material with community organizations, schools, educators, etc., all over the United States of America. So our intention is to continue to build our factory here in Atlanta, to continue to add content, to continue to add research and data, and then to take this empirical support and actually share it with the rest of the world. My closing point is this. If you think about your own life and the fact that you may have had 2 parents and you may even have stability, and yet life isn't always manageable for you. Imagine what it's like for a kid coming from a background like mine, without a father in the home, without the emotional, psychological support and love that they actually need in their lives. It's the intangibles that makes all the difference in the world. Thank you for your time.